Hey everybody, I have another great episode for you today. I have Laekan Kemp on the podcast with me today. She is the author of Somewhere Between Bitter and Sweet, which comes out tomorrow, so make sure that you don't miss this book. She tells me all about her journey to getting published and the hardest part of writing for her, and also shares a little bit about her revision process, which is always super nice to kind of get that in-depth look at what the revision process looks like for different authors. So I hope you guys enjoy this interview. Laekan, let's go ahead and get started. Can you tell me all about your novel, Somewhere Between Bitter and Sweet?
So Somewhere Between Bitter and Sweet is my debut, and it's a story told in two voices. Pen is an aspiring pastry chef who dreams of continuing her father's cooking legacy, but her parents don't think that's such a great idea. But the reasons for that are a little mysterious. On the one hand, it seems like they want her to pick something more practical. But on the other hand, it seems like there's something they're hiding from her about the restaurant itself, which may be why her father is so adamant about her not taking over the place. But Pen has secrets too, and when one of those secrets comes to light, it solidifies Pen's father's opinion that she doesn't belong at the restaurant, and he fires her. The same day, a new hire shows up. His name is Xander, and of course, they're making eyes at each other all night. Besides a romance developing between the two, their lives become even more intertwined when both the restaurant and Xander's immigrant status are threatened. Then he and Pen must work together to save the place they both call home.
Oh, I love it. Sounds so awesome. And Xander, what a great name. I love that. Sometimes those...
I do too.
Yeah, sometimes
it
those...
comes from my obsession with Buffy.
Oh, I was just going to say, I love that name because of my obsession with Buffy as well. Well, this is so exciting. I mean, you have your debut novel coming out into the world. Tell me a little bit about your journey to this point, to being published.
So do we want, like, the small, medium, or large version of this backstory?
Whichever one, the large. Let's go for it.
Okay. I'll try to hit the highlights. So I actually wrote my first book when I was just 17, during my senior year of high school. Something had happened recently in my personal life, and in hindsight, I think writing that first book was just my way of processing that experience emotionally. And I was still working on that same novel during my first year of college. And because I loved it so much, I decided to major in creative writing. It was sort of a last-minute decision. I had always wanted to be a writer, but I was also very involved in, like, clubs and organizations that were really civic-minded, both in my school and my community, that dealt with social issues. So for a little while, I thought I might actually be a social worker. But then my dad ended up getting sick. He was diagnosed with cancer, and I think his diagnosis had an impact on me in just so many different ways, including forcing me to reflect on what I really wanted to do with my life and how I could live it to the fullest. So not that I didn't stray from time to time, I definitely did. But in that moment, I decided to go for it, and I ended up really enjoying my program. I learned a lot about workshop and spotting weaknesses in my own work. But I do want to mention that, you know, due to scholarships and financial aid and the fact that I was working while I went to school, I was able to graduate with zero debt. And I'm not sure if I would recommend doing a creative writing program or an MFA if it's going to require you to take out loans. Just because nowadays there's so many free resources and ways of learning those same skills without having to go into debt. And I think you can learn a lot of the same skills just being, like, a dedicated member of a writing group or joining an online community.
Definitely.
And there's so many great blogs and obviously podcasts like this one. So many fee-based workshops, like through the Highlights Foundation, so that you can save up for those events without, you know, like I said before, having to take on a lot of debt.
Yeah.
But during undergrad, I finished that novel that I had started as a teenager. And with the help of one of my professors, I queried it. And I got a mix of form rejections and personalized rejections, which was really encouraging at the time. I think I also entered a short story contest and ended up winning a prize that same year. think it was just like $100 or something. But
Still.
through that, you also had the opportunity. Yeah, back then it felt like a lot. It is a lot still.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that got me really excited. And through that, you also had the opportunity to pitch something else to that press. So I sent the book off that I had written, and they sent back an offer. But when I showed it to my professor, he was like, no. And he basically walked me through the contract that they sent and showed me all of the red flags that were there. And so he kind of saved me from making a horrible mistake because, like I said, I was sort of caught up in the moment, really excited about it, and he kind of brought me back down to earth. But basically, they were operating as a vanity press, and those kinds of places tend to be very predatory.
Yes.
So, yeah, so it's best to just kind of steer clear of them. So I did. I stayed far away.
Good.
And then I moved on to another project. And after I graduated, my partner and I moved to Florida so he could finish school. And I didn't know anyone there. And since we were only going to be living there for a very short period of time, I really didn't make an effort to socialize. I mean, I'm 100% an introvert anyway, but I decided to just take that time in another state, kind of away from family and friends, to hunker down and write as much as I possibly could. I was also grieving at the time over losing my father to cancer, and writing was just a place for me to process once again.
Yeah. And
it was truly an escape during that time and just a safe place for me to express myself. But while we were living there, many of my coworkers at this data analysis company that I was temping at, they were also artists, and some of them were writers, some were graphic designers. A lot of them were in a band together, and none of them were going the traditional route for whatever it was they were making. It was all DIY, and it just looked like so much fun. And that's kind of how I got turned onto self-publishing.
Yeah.
At the time, I was learning more about the industry, particularly Kidlit. And I realized that me writing Latinx protagonists could have played a role in the rejections I had been receiving, just based on some of the language. Mind you, this was back in 2012, so it was a different time. It was before, We Need Diverse Books, and before DV Pit, and sort of before this push for more diverse characters and own voices authors. So back then, I made the decision to self-publish that first novel. And over the next 4 years, I ended up self-publishing a total of 7 books, including a paranormal romance series, which actually gained me an audience, which was so unexpected and so exciting.
Very.
Yeah, so by 2015, I was making more money from self-publishing than the 2 jobs I had at the time, a full-time job and a part-time job combined. And you would think that I would maybe take that as a sign to quit those 2 jobs and start writing full time. But
no.
I did not do that, unfortunately. And I mentioned earlier about there being times when I kind of strayed from my original dreams and original goals. And this was one of those times, because instead of going after this dream of being an author full force, I went back to school to get a master's degree in education, and I became a teacher. So I made a very fear-based decision, and I don't want to say that I necessarily regret it, but I do see that I was just very much operating in that way.
Yeah.
In most of my life, making decisions based on, what was going to bring me security, what I thought was going to kind of quell my fears and anxiety. So I wish that I had made a different choice instead of listening to my anxiety, but that's the choice that I ended up making. So I became a teacher. I loved my students, but I hated everything else. It's a very difficult career that conditions you just to take abuse day in and day out. And after about 3 years of that, I was just physically, I was an absolute wreck. My anxiety was at a level 10 every single day. My body was reacting to all of that stress It was starting to manifest physically for me. They're getting a lot of like migraines, nerve sensations that kind of harken back to a time in my life previously where I had the shingles. So my body was talking to me and trying to tell me that I was in a stressful situation that was not healthy for me.
Yeah.
And so in December of 2018, I wrote this very emotional blog post about how I was going to finally chase after my dream of being a published author, like really do it in earnest. And I was so serious about it that I even gave myself a timeline. I made this online declaration that I was giving myself 18 months to make the transition to writing full time. I didn't have a book deal yet. I didn't even have an agent, but I was just so done with my current circumstances that I just sort of went all in. And I've blogged a little bit more specifically about the things I did during this time to get me closer to my goal, so I won't get into all of those details. But there were a few significant choices that I made that I think made all the difference. And one of those things was seeking out resources. I paid for a 100-page manuscript critique with Eric Smith through the Manuscript Academy, and I used his feedback to cut something like 20,000 words from my work in progress. I completely overhauled the story.
Nice.
And then I participated in DV Pit that spring. This was now 2019. And I got my agent in May and my book deal in June.
Wow.
But the absolute best part of this story is what happened this past summer, which is that I quit my teaching job due to the pandemic. And without even realizing it, I met that 18-month deadline that I had set for myself back in December of 2018.
Oh, that's awesome.
So I think the moral of my story is affirmations definitely work. Visualization works. Like, all of it works.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely works. I mean, you had, I think all the authors on the podcast answer this question. I mean, most of them have kind of like a windy journey to the point that they're at now, right? Like having a book coming out. But, I'm sure you learned so much from all of the detours and all that stuff that you took to land you to where you are now.
Yeah, I think that's an optimistic way to look at it.
Definitely.
And I try to see it that way. I try to see the silver lining.
Yeah.
Especially because I don't want to discount how much I truly cared for my students and loved spending time with them. So I don't regret going into the profession, but it was so hard. And really the main reason why I did it was because I was scared.
Yeah.
Of taking the more creative path.
Oh, yeah. Because that one has less security afforded to it, and it's a little bit more unstable, a little bit more up and down. But I can look back at my own life too, and I see those things where I'm like, oh, okay, maybe not my best decision, not the best way I could have gone, but I wouldn't, I wouldn't be who I am without having gone through that, and you wouldn't, be who you are, I think, in your spot right now if you hadn't done that. I mean, who knows how your life would have gone if you hadn't done teaching. Maybe it would have been a different detour, but I love that you met your 18-month goal without even really realizing it. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I had forgotten about it and was so stressed about the pandemic because things were changing on the campus where I was teaching day to day. They were making decisions overnight and just kind of springing them on us in the morning, and just all of those things in flux. It was just so stressful.
Yeah.
And I realized that the reason I was under so much stress was because I had no control in that situation, or at least that was my perception of it.
Right.
But then I realized, but if I quit, like in a way, that's me taking back control, because I get to decide whether or not I want to put myself in that kind of situation where I don't feel safe.
Yeah, that is definitely, I think, you taking back control. Well, I love your journey. I love the different up and downs you've been on. Tell me a little bit about querying, how querying went for you throughout this whole journey, and then maybe any tips you have for writers, looking back on it all, who are in the querying process right now.
So that first time that I queried was back in 2010, I believe. So I don't even really remember that particular process. But for the book that is now my debut, I did actually query that to a handful of agents. And I think I sent it to probably just 3 or 4 of them. And they were agents that I knew of because I'd seen them on Twitter. So I wasn't necessarily being super discerning at the time. I was just kind of trying to get my feet wet. But I think from both experiences, writing a good synopsis is not only essential for a great query letter, but you'll also need to know how to write a good synopsis when you go out on submission with a book, when your editor asks for back jacket copy. So I would focus on that part of your query letter being as strong as possible. And I would recommend reading the back jackets of books that have similar themes or in a similar genre to yours. And then try to pay attention to what's included and also what's not included. So which words or phrases pique your interest, and then also look at how the synopsis is structured. How many paragraphs are there? How are they transitioning between paragraphs? What's mentioned first and how they build on that information. And then what about that final sentence is kind of cueing you to buy the book, and then see how you can mimic that in your own synopsis. I'm a big fan of using mentor texts and looking at how other writers do things. So I think that's something that you can definitely practice doing with your own query with probably just the books that you have at home on your bookshelf.
When you say synopsis, you mean like the 1 to 2 page document laying out everything in the manuscript, right?
Or I think some people refer to it as the summary, because I think my query letters and the ones that I've seen have only been about a page. Like the first paragraph is usually an introduction, some biographical information.
Right.
Second paragraph or next 2 to 3 paragraphs is maybe the synopsis or the summary. But the ones that I have written have never been longer than what's on a back jacket of a book.
Okay. Just because when I hear synopsis, I think of the document that like tells all the spoilers. But I think what you're referring to is just the query letter and, you know, the meat of the query letter that's about your story that's trying to entice the agent.
Yeah,
okay.
Maybe I should just call it a pitch.
Yes, there we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because that way, you know, you're giving just enough to get them interested. And when they're reading it, they feel like how they would feel if they were browsing through a bookstore.
For sure.
And so if it's something that would make them want to pick up the book and buy it, then you already know that you're on the right track.
Oh, yeah. And I think, you know, your advice of checking out other books that are in your same genre, or even just random books, too, that you have on your bookshelf, seeing what that back jacket copy is very helpful, because writing a query is a very different type of writing than writing your manuscript. So if you're new at it or you need a refresher, see how other people are doing it and see how they're phrasing things, and you know what about it excites you. If you're a little bit stuck, is always a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
Well, awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I think that is a wonderful tip. My next question for you is a 2-parter. I'd love to know for you, what is the hardest part of writing, and what is the hardest part of being an author?
So when it comes to writing, my first instinct is to say everything. I'm a very mood-based creative, so something that is driving me nuts one day can be my absolute favorite thing the next day. I think it also depends a lot on the story. Sometimes the drafting process is a slog, like with my book 2 on my contract with Little Brown, although that could also be because, you know, I'm working during a pandemic. Obviously, those circumstances affect my mood big time. So I think that's what it's really about for me, not necessarily which part of the writing process I'm engaged in, but how that is or isn't in harmony with other things going on in my life.
Yeah.
I
was just going to say, I can resonate with that. I'm very, mood-based too with that sort of thing. And so there are some days if I have too much going on in my head, like I just can't even sit down and write. But then the next day I could have, just something different and it works perfect. So sometimes it's like I'm my biggest hurdle that I have to get over.
Yeah, I hate when I get an email or a DM in the morning that is like bad news or something that's going to make me angry.
Right.
Because then I'm like, well, now my day is shot because all I'm going to be doing is thinking about this other problem over here. But something that has helped me is having, like, I don't know if you can see right now, I have a lamp behind my desk, and then I have my ring light in front of my laptop, and I'll kind of turn that on, but leave it on a low, just keep it on low light. And there's something about that is a creative trigger for me. When I have really low lighting, everything feels really relaxed and cozy.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a little bit easier to slip into the work rather than feeling this sense of urgency, if I had like the actual room light on or if I had the windows open. So I know some people like to write near window. They like to write near natural light. And I think I've heard that that's actually good for you to do. But I kind of like to be in my little dark dungeon when I'm working. There's just something about that relaxes me.
Oh, I love that. I have like little twinkly lights above around some frames, like right in front of my desk, and I love to turn that on and have that low, very gentle, soft light as I write. It's nice rather than, super bright in the room. I'm with you on that one.
Yeah, I think that's why they keep the lights like that, like when you go get a massage.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so I just keep my office like a massage parlor.
Yes, there you go. Well, what about the second part? What's the hardest part of being an author for you?
I think it's definitely not being able to control or even see a direct correlation between your productivity and your success. And that's with every part of the writing process, the bookmaking process and beyond. I feel like writing books is sort of like playing the lottery. As in, just because you write something, that doesn't mean a publisher is going to acquire it.
Yep.
And even once they do acquire it, that doesn't guarantee that people are actually going to buy it. So, for example, I have virtual events, that are starting next week, leading up to my debut in April. And I have no clue if those are actually helping me sell books. I mean, I hope they are, and I definitely spend hours preparing for them as if they will, but the truth is I could put in all of that time and effort and not sell a single copy. And for me, that's the most nerve-wracking and frustrating part of the process.
I can definitely resonate with that, and I think, too, that I feel like that starts in the querying process, like you said, you don't even know if a publisher will buy it, but also you don't know if an agent will resonate with your story. Or for some reason, I feel like authors all get into the same brain wave and like write very similar types of stories in waves. And so it's like yours just might be too late in the wave and, the market is already oversaturated. There's so many different things that, you don't have control over, and you kind of just got to be along for the ride, which is hard. I like to be in control of as many things as I can be. Well,
Yeah, agreed.
Yes. Well, let's flip this question. So instead of the hardest part, tell me the best part of being a writer and being an author for you.
For me, that is where I get most of my human connection from. I was talking to a writer friend recently, and she was talking about her own creative process and saying that something that helps her work when she's feeling a little anxious or a little overwhelmed by the work is making some kind of connection to her ancestors that she believes are watching over her while she works. And I really loved that idea or this notion that when we're creating, we're not creating alone. And for me, I think that's what I value about every other stage of the process. That when I share a work in progress with my agent, that I'm getting feedback from her, that, someone is reading and enjoying the work. When an editor acquires it, same thing. Usually once you get to that point, it means not just the editor, but other people in-house have read it and enjoyed it. And then once the book gets published, like getting feedback from readers, getting emails from readers, it still is sort of unbelievable to me that something was living inside my head and then I put it down on paper and it created this connection that I didn't have before. And especially writing for my community and writing for teenagers and young people who identify as Latinx or Chicane or, Mexican American, those connections are even more meaningful to me because there weren't a lot of those books when I was growing up.
Yeah.
There were a few that I could find and that I had access to in my public library, but there was just nothing like what we have now. And I really love and feel so honored that I get to contribute to this canon of Latinx literature for young people that's being developed right now. It means a lot to me.
That's wonderful. I mean, you're getting to, be that person for teenagers or young adults who, you probably wanted to have and find when you were a teenager, and to make those connections. I mean, it's just so special. There's something so special about like the reader-author connection, and too, thinking about like your readers connecting with each other over a love of a book. Like, isn't that the best when you have a conversation with somebody else who loves the same book you do? Is pretty wonderful.
Yeah, and for some reason, whenever I think about publication, I always think of that Renaissance painting. I can't remember what it's called, but it's like God on one side, I think Adam on the other, and like their fingers are almost touching.
Yeah.
And I always think of publication as being sort of like that. Like I'm putting this out in the world, but it's not really alive until an audience has access to it, until a reader opens the pages and breathes life into these characters.
I love that. I mean, I feel like that's why we do all of this and we slave over these stories, is for that connection to have somebody be, as much in love with your story as you are. That's wonderful. Well, that is definitely the best part, for sure. My next question is more about your writing style. So when you're drafting, do you find yourself as more of a pantser, more of a planner, or somewhere in between?
I'm not sure who made up this phrase, but I consider myself a headlights writer, meaning I usually start out with no outline. And then I get deeper into drafting, I might start outlining a few chapters ahead of me. So just enough to keep the momentum going, so I'm not starting from scratch every single day, but not so much that I lose the potential for exploring. And I also tend to be an overwriter, so I end up with a ton of words that I then have to cut, but I do always hold on to them in sort of like a graveyard file that I sometimes end up pulling from during revisions. I think I work in a way that lessens the psychological obstacles that I have to face when I sit down to work, but also doesn't totally get rid of the excitement and the discovery in the process.
Yes, I love that. I definitely am very similar of a writer. At first I thought you said head lice writer, and I was like, I have never heard that term before, but you said lights. And I got it after a minute. But no, I love to do that too. This book I just finished drafting, I was very much the same way. I had like specific moments that I knew along the way, but I would, kind of write and outline as I went, which for me, I can't outline a full novel because then my brain will just not want to write the book because I feel like I've already written it. So this is a good way too, that I feel like it helps me not struggle through the drafting so much, and also helps me on the revision side. Like I have to do a little bit less because I used to be a complete pantser, which is so fun and freeing, but it's like so hard on the revision end because you have to do so much, I feel like.
Yeah, there's definitely things I've had to tweak about my process now that I'm writing under deadline, because that's just a totally different experience than when you're setting your own deadlines.
Yeah.
And especially for this second book, I think with my first book, I had a little over 2 months for developmental edits, which was very comfortable for me. And this time, the first round initially it was only going to be 3 weeks. And so, yeah, my reaction, exactly. So I went ahead and asked for an additional week, and luckily they gave me one, but it just made me realize that, someone else is setting these deadlines for me. And if my current process is not conducive to me finishing on time, then there's things that I have to change. So I've definitely sought out more resources on that so that I can kind of adapt my process so that I'm not killing myself trying to get the revisions done or trying to get the drafting done. But I think I'm still learning because writing under contract is still pretty new to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think
but this one is definitely fast and furious.
Oh, yes, that is very fast and furious. I think that's a good note, too, for people who are listening who, are in the querying stage, like realizing that things change when you have an agent, have an editor on deadline and on contract. You might have to adjust how you do things a little bit. My next question is about your revision. Right. Yeah. My next question is about your revision process. So, of course, you have your amazing agent, amazing editor. But what do you do, like, just with you or maybe CPs that you use before you send things off to your agent to make sure your manuscript is in, like, the best shape it can be?
So, in addition to partially outlining, well, let me rephrase that. One of the reasons that I only partially outline and only outline a few chapters ahead is because I do a bit of editing as I go, and I'm usually working my way back and forth, like from the beginning of the manuscript to the closest endpoint. And that's really just because as I'm drafting and discovering more about the story, those discoveries usually have ripple effects. And even though I could probably ignore them and just keep going, sometimes it's something that I would just rather address while it's on my mind. But like I mentioned before, that's not always the best strategy when you're writing under deadline. So that was kind of like my natural process, like how I work in the wild.
Yeah.
But this has been a whole new experience, and one that requires so much efficiency and time management. So I actually use Julie C. Dow's revision method. She blogged about it on the Publishing Crawl website, and it truly set me free. When I got those first notes from my editor, it was so overwhelming, and I wasn't sure if I was actually going to be able to do it. It just felt like too much. And, shook my confidence for a minute.
Yeah.
But I used Julie's method, and I made a list of every single note and change that needed to be made, and then I just started working through them. Sometimes I worked in order. Sometimes on days when I had very little energy, I worked through like the smallest or the easiest changes first. But little by little, I worked my way through the entire list, and at the end, not only was I so relieved and exhausted, but I also now had this proof that I could work under deadline, that I could meet the expectations of my contract, and basically that I could keep doing this. Like I could keep writing books and hopefully selling them and just making a career out of this. So that was how I revised my debut. And I still really love her method. I'm still using her revision method for book 2 on my contract. But this one just feels like a different animal. So I'm also, like, right now, as I'm speaking to you, still in the process of trying to figure out how to revise this story. Because, like I said, there's the time crunch and the pandemic, and so this story needs something different, and I'm still sort of trying to figure out what that is. But I do recommend her blog post and that resource for anyone who needs some help figuring out how to start, how to create a revision process for themselves.
I love that. That's definitely a good recommendation. And, for you and your revision that you're going through right now, definitely, I would say just give yourself lots of grace because it is such a weird time to be doing all of this. But, you can do it and read a book, do whatever you need to do to like refill your well, right? I know it can be hard on deadline, but I always say that sometimes not writing is still writing, if you've got to refill your well to get back in the game. My next thing, I'd love for you to share with me something your readers wouldn't necessarily know about you.
This one's hard. Because first of all, I don't think I'm very interesting. And second of all, anything of interest is probably on my website. And there's not much there. I mean, I don't know if this is cheating to kind of repeat a previous answer, but I think readers would be surprised to know how many of us come from self-publishing and transition over to traditional publishing. I know that some people have some preconceived notions or negative feelings towards self-publishing, but I found it to be a very welcoming space when I was writing about characters of color and writing about the Latinx community. And at the time I was self-publishing, there were a lot of BIPOC authors and people self-publishing, especially in the YA, new adult and romance genres, because it was just a place where we could tell the kind of stories that we wanted to tell. And yeah, so I think people might be surprised to know that, especially since I've taken all my old books off of Amazon. Like when people go to visit my Goodreads page, they'll be like, what are all of these?
Yeah. I think that
so they're confused. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that counts. I think that you're totally right. There are people that have, preconceived ideas about people who self-publish or what that means and all of that. And I think, there's a really real business there, that it's a really real avenue to get your books out if you want to have more control over things and are willing to do like all the work of marketing and editing and all that stuff. Because there are some authors who do that and do great and like have really big followings. Like you said, you got a following for your paranormal romance books, and I think you just have to put the legwork in, don't you? Like it's a different beast when you're the one doing all of it.
Yeah, it is a lot of work, which is why I stopped doing it. But turns out traditional publishing is also a lot of work.
Right. Just in a different way, right?
Yeah. The benefit, though, is that, I have a team at my publisher that is building on whatever I'm doing, that they're, they have more resources than I do. They have a wider reach than I do. Yeah. And so I'm able to leverage all of those things that I didn't have access to before.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. But I do think that counts.
Okay, good.
Good. Yeah, you're good. Well, my next question, I feel like you gave me the answer to this a little bit already, but you told me about how you wrote your first manuscript in high school when you were 17, right? That's when you started writing it. Tell me a little bit about, your love of writing, and is that the first moment that you thought, okay, I'm going to write a story and this is what I could do, or when did that love of writing really begin?
I think for most authors, it probably started with a love of reading. Mm-hmm. I actually have a hard time remembering experiences from childhood. I'm not sure why, but I just don't have a lot of memories that have stuck.
Yeah.
But the ones that have usually revolve around books. So my mother read to me constantly. She would read those Richard Scarry books. He does the watercolor illustrations where the animals are acting like people. Mother Goose nursery rhymes, even my cousin's school textbooks that they left at the house. So just basically anything we could get our hands on. And we would read them over and over until they literally fell apart and like no longer had covers on. So those kinds of things definitely fed my imagination. And I was constantly playing make-believe, which I now consider my earliest attempts at telling stories. I was just always making things up, and sometimes even just like straight up lying, because whatever I imagined was so much more interesting than reality. So I think that's how storytelling started for me. And then once I learned to write, it wasn't long before my abilities started getting the attention of teachers who encouraged me to keep at it, which I did. And over the years, it's just been the only thing I've ever truly excelled at. And I think because it made me feel good about myself and it gave me this confidence, I just never stopped, which is why Somewhere Between Bitter and Sweet, my debut, is actually the 9th book that I've written.
I love it. Yeah, I mean, I feel like with every single book you write, you continue to get better, and you know you've had a lot of practice writing since an early age. But I do think you're right. I think a lot of authors have the same answer. Like, a love of storytelling and writing began as a love of reading, because I mean, books are amazing, and how could you not fall in love with them?
Right.
Well, I have just one final question for you. It is probably the hardest one I've asked you so far. I'd love to know what your favorite book is right now. This isn't your favorite book of all time, just something you've read recently that you're, like, obsessed with.
Yeah, that did make it more difficult, because if you were asking my favorite book of all time, of course I have an answer that will never change until the day I die. But favorite books right now, I don't know if I can pick one, but I have read some really great books recently. I loved Running by Natalia Sylvester, and I loved We Are Not From Here by Jenny Torres Sanchez. And I recently listened to an audiobook called Burnout that was about anxiety and the stress cycle. And I'm currently reading a book called Wintering, which is on a similar topic, sort of about slowing down and just taking time for yourself. Overfunctioning is a big problem for me. Working all the time is a big problem for me.
Yeah.
So it's just a book about how that's not healthy, how there's a season for everything.
Yeah.
And there's a season for recovery, which I tend to skip. So I'm trying to learn how to do that better.
Yes. Well, thank you for answering those. And yeah, I mean, you can give me more than one favorite book right now is perfect, because we all need more recommendations for books to read, right? Thank you so much for chatting with me today and telling me all about your debut, Somewhere Between Bitter and Sweet. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please make sure you are subscribed so you never miss an episode. Make sure you rate and review this podcast wherever you are listening, and share it with your friends. Find me on Instagram and Twitter at RoseQuinny, QUINNY. Can you say bye-bye? Say bye-bye.